HMS Furious, she was designed to carry two of the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a British warship, the 18-inch BL Mark I naval gun. Ironically, she would never carry both these guns, and to understand why, we have to understand the mind of Admiral Sir John Fisher. Fisher was the visionary First Sea Lord who had already revolutionized naval warfare with HMS Dreadnought in 1906. When he returned to the Admiralty during the First World War, he brought with him a controversial and highly ambitious strategic vision known as the Baltic Project. Fisher believed that the grueling trench warfare of the Western Front could be bypassed by using the Royal Navy to land Russian troops directly onto the German coastline, just 90 miles from Berlin. However, the German coast was notoriously shallow and heavily protected by thick concrete fortifications, dense minefields, and powerful coastal batteries. To execute the Baltic Project, Fisher required a completely new type of warship. He needed vessels with a shallow draft to navigate the Baltic shoals, extreme speed to outrun retaliation, and massive guns to obliterate coastal fortresses from a distance where the ship could not be easily targeted in return. This requirement gave birth to the Courageous class of large light cruisers, an unprecedented and somewhat contradictory ship type. While her half-sisters, Courageous and Glorious, were armed with 15-inch guns, Furious was designed to be the ultimate coastal bombardment vessel. Her blueprint called for just two enormous weapons, one 18-inch turret forward and one 18-inch turret aft. But before she could begin any meaningful operational career, the Royal Navy had already decided to remove one of them. HMS Furious never fought as the two-turret battlecruiser she had been designed to become. This simple fact immediately raises a compelling question. Why would the Admiralty spend immense resources to build Britain's biggest gunship, only to remove its primary weapons almost straight away? To understand the decision to alter HMS Furious, we must first look at the incredible engineering of the weapon she was built to carry. The 18-inch BL Mark I naval gun was a marvel of destructive potential. The decision to jump from the standard 15-inch gun to an 18-inch bore was driven entirely by the need to guarantee the absolute destruction of reinforced concrete bunkers. The sheer scale of these weapons was staggering. Each gun barrel measured nearly 60 feet in length and weighed over 149 tons. They fired an armor-piercing projectile that weighed 3,320 pounds, roughly the weight of a modern mid-sized family car. Propelled by massive charges of cordite, these shells could be hurled at targets nearly 29,000 yards away. Mounting these weapons on a warship required colossal infrastructure. Each of the two single-gun turrets weighed well over 800 tons. Deep within the ship's hull, vast magazines were constructed to house the gigantic shells and the highly volatile powder bags. Moving a projectile that weighed over 1.5 tons required specialized, heavy-duty loading machinery. Extensive hydraulic systems were built to drive the shell hoists, rotate the massive armored gun house, and operate the complex rammers that pushed the shell into the breech. Operating just one of these turrets required a dedicated, highly trained crew working in perfect synchronization. It is crucial to remember that these weapons were not designed for conventional fleet engagements. They were highly specialized siege weapons, intended to smash German coastal batteries from long range. They fired too slowly, and carried too few shells in a single salvo, to easily track and destroy a fast-moving enemy dreadnought on the open sea. Their purpose was singular and destructive. But building a gun this large created entirely new physical problems for the ship force to carry it. When looking at the swift removal of these massive weapons, a natural assumption is that the guns must have been a failure. The common myth is that firing the 18-inch gun caused catastrophic structural damage to the ship, breaking the hull or snapping the keel. The truth is much simpler, and much more interesting: the guns actually worked. The 18-inch Mark I was successfully tested and proved to be an incredibly effective piece of artillery. The Royal Navy did not remove them because they were technical failures. During gunnery trials, the weapon demonstrated excellent range and formidable striking power. The ship's internal hydraulic systems absorbed the massive recoil, and while the hull certainly experienced heavy vibration, the ship's structural integrity was never compromised by the firing of the weapon. The real issue was the environmental violence of the blast. Firing a 3,320-pound shell at high velocity displaces a massive amount of air, creating an enormous shockwave known as overpressure. When the 18-inch gun fired, the concussive force radiating outward was devastating to anything not shielded by heavy armor. Gun crews and deck personnel had to immediately clear all exposed areas before a firing mission. The overpressure was strong enough to pop rivets, loosen weather deck fittings, strip paint directly off the steel bulkheads, and shatter glass throughout the ship's superstructure. Under normal circumstances, a battleship crew could adapt to this environment. But Furious was not destined for normal circumstances. It was immediately obvious that a delicate aircraft, built of doped canvas, thin wood, and tension wires, could never safely sit on the deck while one of these guns fired. This reality naturally set up the great collision of technologies that would define the ship's life. While Furious was being laid down and constructed, a new form of warfare was rapidly evolving. Naval aviation was taking its first tentative steps. At this stage, naval officers did not view aircraft as weapons that would replace heavy naval guns. Instead, aircraft were seen as crucial support assets. They could fly beyond the horizon to scout for the enemy fleet, spot the fall of shot for battleships, and intercept enemy zeppelins. However, aircraft technology was improving incredibly quickly. As Furious was nearing completion in 1917, the Admiralty looked at her design and saw an opportunity. The ship featured a massive, elongated hull to accommodate her high-speed engines. This resulted in a huge, empty forecastle forward of her bridge. The Admiralty began asking a radical question. Could this expansive forward section become a flying-off deck? The decision was made swiftly, almost immediately after the ship was commissioned, and before she could undertake any meaningful combat patrols as a two-gun battlecruiser, she was returned to the shipyard. The forward 18-inch turret was removed entirely. In its place, a long, wooden flight deck was constructed over the bow, complete with a hangar underneath to store seaplanes and wheeled aircraft. The ship had barely entered service before this drastic change happened. It is vital to stress that this alteration was not made because the forward 18-inch gun had failed. It was made because the science of aviation was advancing faster than anyone had anticipated, and the Royal Navy urgently needed a high-speed platform to take those aircraft to sea. Following her first conversion, HMS Furious emerged as one of the most bizarre warships ever to sail. She now carried a single 18-inch gun aft, a large central superstructure, and a wooden flight deck forward. Could these two radically different methods of warfare coexist on the same hull? The short answer was no. They operated together very poorly. The blast damage from the aft gun proved completely incompatible with aviation. As previously established, the shockwave from the 18-inch weapon was a threat to the structural integrity of the fragile fabric aircraft. If the ship needed to engage a surface target, the deck crews had to halt all aviation preparations. Aircraft could not be stored on the open deck, and mechanics could not service engines or load ordnance while the main battery was in action. The operational limitations were so severe that gunfire and aircraft operation simply could not realistically happen together. The ship was forced to operate as either a gunship or an aviation ship at any given moment, but never both simultaneously. Despite these severe limitations, Furious pushed the boundaries of naval aviation forward. In August 1917, Squadron Commander Edwin Dunning made history. Flying a Sopwith Pup, he flew alongside the moving ship, side-slipped over the forward flight deck, and carefully touched down while deck crews physically grabbed handles on the aircraft to pull it to a stop. It was the first time an aircraft had ever landed on a moving warship. Dunning's historic landing was a moment of triumph, proving the immense promise of aircraft carriers. Tragically, during another attempt days later, his aircraft suffered an engine issue, drifted off the deck, and Dunning was killed. His death highlighted another fatal flaw in the ship's hybrid design. Landing on the forward deck required pilots to fly around the ship's large central superstructure. But the remaining aft 18-inch turret created an even bigger problem. The massive armored barbette, the wide gun house, and the tall funnel created terrible, swirling wind turbulence across the rear of the ship. For pilots trying to make a delicate, low-speed approach in early biplanes, this turbulent airflow made landings extremely dangerous, if not entirely impossible. The massive gun was not just a blast hazard, it was actively interfering with the aerodynamics needed to operate aircraft safely. This fatal aerodynamic reality became the undeniable reason that the second gun had to disappear. In late 1917, HMS Furious returned to the dockyard, and the final 18-inch turret was hoisted off the ship. A second flight deck was built aft of the superstructure to allow aircraft to land safely without having to maneuver around the ship's bridge. Removing the aft turret did far more than just eliminate the dangerous wind turbulence. It sparked an internal spatial revolution. A battleship turret is only the tip of an iceberg. Beneath that armored gun house sat a massive cylindrical barbette, heavily armored shell rooms, cordite magazines, and large pump rooms required to operate the hydraulic machinery. When the gun was removed, all of this infrastructure was removed with it. This freed up thousands of cubic feet of internal volume. This space was immediately repurposed to create the true heart of an aircraft carrier. The former gun compartments provided the necessary room for expanded hangars and aircraft lifts. The deeply buried, heavily protected cordite magazines were perfectly suited to be converted into aviation fuel storage and bomb storage. The shell handling rooms became maintenance workshops, and the spaces once occupied by heavy gun crews were turned into dedicated crew spaces for armorers, mechanics, and pilots. This wasn't simply a matter of removing a gun to flatten the deck. It was the process of replacing one weapon system with an entirely different way of fighting. By removing the massive artillery, Furious solved her space constraints and accelerated the Royal Navy's understanding of carrier warfare. She was no longer just a converted battlecruiser, she was laying the architectural groundwork for every aircraft carrier that would follow. Following the First World War, Furious was taken in hand once more. The awkward central superstructure was removed entirely, and she was rebuilt with a single, flush flight deck running continuously from bow to stern. She had achieved full carrier conversion. When the Second World War began, the ship that had been designed to bombard the German coast in 1915 found herself fighting an entirely different kind of war. She served with distinction during the Norwegian campaign, ferried critical fighter reinforcements to Malta during the darkest days of the Mediterranean theater, and escorted vital Arctic convoys through freezing, hostile waters. During these years, everything the Admiralty had gambled on when they removed her guns eventually became the dominant form of naval warfare. The world watched as carrier aircraft crippled the Italian fleet at Taranto. They witnessed the devastating strike on Pearl Harbor. And they saw the grim reality of the new era when the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse were sunk entirely by land-based aircraft. The giant naval gun, once the absolute arbiter of sea power, had been eclipsed by the airplane. It is easy to look at the brief, strange history of the 18-inch naval gun and assume it was a flawed concept. But the truth is, the guns actually worked remarkably well. They achieved exactly what Admiral Fisher asked of them. They threw an unimaginably heavy shell over an incredible distance with devastating force. The problem was that while Britain was building the biggest naval guns in its history, someone had invented something even more powerful. The airplane could strike far beyond the horizon, maneuver around any coastal fortification, and deliver ordnance with a precision that no artillery piece could match. HMS Furious didn't lose her guns because they were ineffective. She lost them because naval warfare changed fundamentally before she ever had the opportunity to prove what those guns could do. She became the physical bridge between two distinct eras, the twilight of the age of the battleship and the dawn of the age of the aircraft carrier. In the end, HMS Furious is remembered not as Britain's greatest gunship, but as the experimental vessel that sacrificed her main armament to help prove that the future of naval warfare belonged in the sky. From the gun decks to the bridge, every story we tell honors those who served. If this tale made you feel the salt and steel of history, give it a like, and if you're not yet part of our channel's convoy, subscribe and join the ranks. More powerful stories await.